Before you write another check to your adult child, before you transfer another dollar from your savings, before you say yes one more time to a request for financial help, I need you to stop and listen to me for the next few minutes. I am 72 years old, and I need to warn you about something I wish someone had warned me about 30 years ago. My dear friends, what I am about to share with you comes from painful, hard-won experience. I am not a financial advisor. I am not a psychologist. I am simply a father, a grandfather, and someone who has lived long enough to watch generosity, offered with the very best intentions, quietly destroy relationships, drain retirements, and rob good parents of the peaceful later years they had spent decades working toward. I want to be clear from the very beginning. This is not a message telling you to stop loving your children, or to stop caring about their struggles. This is a warning about something far more specific and far more dangerous than simple generosity. It is a warning about giving money without understanding what that money actually costs, not just financially, but emotionally, relationally, and in ways that often do not reveal themselves until many years later, when it is far too late to undo the damage. If you love your children, and if you have ever handed them money out of love, out of guilt, or out of fear of what might happen if you said no, I ask you to give me your full attention today. Because what I am about to tell you may be the most important financial conversation you have with yourself all year. My story, let me tell you how I learned this lesson, because I believe my story will feel familiar to many of you. My wife and I raised 3 children. We were not wealthy, but we work hard, save consistently, and by the time I reached my late 50s, we had built a retirement that felt secure. We believed we had done everything right. Then, one by one, our children became adults, and one by one, the requests began. It started small. Help with a car repair. Help with a security deposit on an apartment. These felt reasonable to us. What kind of parent refuses to help their child through a temporary difficulty? We gave without hesitation, and honestly, in those early years, it felt good to help. But small requests, my friends, have a way of growing into larger ones. The car repair became a request for a new car entirely, because the old one, they explained, was unreliable and unsafe. The security deposit became ongoing help with rent, because their salary, they explained, simply was not enough to cover the cost of living in the city where they had chosen to work. What began as occasional assistance slowly transformed into something we never intended, a permanent financial obligation that we had never explicitly agreed to, but had somehow accepted anyway, simply by never saying no. By the time I turned 68, I sat down with my wife one evening to review our finances honestly, and what I discovered frightened me deeply. Over the previous 15 years, we had given away an amount of money that, had we invested it instead, would have doubled our retirement savings. We had delayed our own retirement by nearly 4 years because of the money we continued giving. And worse than the financial cost, I began to notice something troubling in how my children treated me. The gratitude I once received for small gestures of help had slowly disappeared. Requests had become expectations. Thank you had become simply assumed. And on the rare occasions I hesitated or expressed concern about my own financial security, I was met not with understanding, but with frustration, even irritation, as though I had somehow failed to fulfill an obligation they had come to believe I owed them. This, my friends, is when I finally understood the warning I want to give you today. The warning here is the core truth I learned, often painfully, through years of experience. Money given to adult children without clear boundaries does not usually strengthen the relationship. More often, it slowly poisons it, while simultaneously endangering your own financial security in your most vulnerable years. I want to explain exactly why this happens, because understanding the mechanism behind it is what finally gave me the strength to change my patterns. When you give money freely, without limits, without conditions, you are not simply transferring dollars. You are quietly transferring a message. And that message, whether you intend it or not, often becomes, my resources exist for your use, and your comfort matters more than my security. Your children may never consciously think this thought. Most of them love you and would be horrified to hear it described this way. But behavior follows patterns, and patterns, repeated often enough, become expectations, regardless of anyone's conscious intentions. The danger is not that your children are ungrateful or manipulative, though in some difficult cases, unfortunately, this can happen. The danger, for most families, is far more subtle and far more human. It is simply that people, all people, including our own children, gradually adjust their expectations to match whatever pattern has been established. If the pattern is unlimited generosity, the expectation becomes unlimited generosity. And when that expectation eventually meets a limit, whether because you finally say no, or because your own resources genuinely run out, the reaction is often confusion, frustration, or even anger, because the limit feels, to them, like a betrayal of an unspoken agreement they did not realize was never actually a promise. The 5 warning signs I wish I had recognized sooner. I want to walk you through 5 specific warning signs that I now recognize, looking back, that I completely missed at the time. If you notice any of these patterns in your own family, I urge you to pay close attention, because I believe they are early indicators of a pattern that, left unaddressed, tends to grow rather than resolve on its own. The first warning sign: the requests increase rather than decrease. In a healthy financial relationship, temporary help should eventually become unnecessary as your child's circumstances stabilize. If instead you notice that requests are becoming more frequent, or larger, over time rather than less frequent, this is a significant warning sign. It suggests that the help you are providing is not solving an underlying problem. It is simply removing the natural consequences that would otherwise force a solution. The second warning sign: the conversations center increasingly on money. Pay close attention to what your conversations with your adult children actually consist of. In healthy relationships, financial matters occupy a small, occasional portion of your interactions. If you notice that a significant portion of your calls, visits, or messages involve some form of financial need, request, or discussion, this is worth examining honestly. It may indicate that the relationship itself has become organized primarily around your role as a financial resource rather than your role as a parent and a person. The third warning sign: you feel anxious before saying no. This warning sign lives inside you rather than in your child's behavior, and I believe it is one of the most important to recognize. If the thought of declining a financial request from your adult child fills you with significant anxiety, guilt, or fear about how they will react, this suggests that the relationship has developed an imbalance where your peace of mind has become contingent on your continued giving. A healthy relationship should allow you to say no occasionally without triggering overwhelming guilt or fear of serious relational damage. The fourth warning sign: your own financial plans are being delayed or compromised. I want you to be brutally honest with yourself about this one, because I was not honest with myself for far too many years. Are you delaying your own retirement because of ongoing financial support to your children? Are you dipping into savings meant for your own healthcare, your own home maintenance, your own future security, in order to meet their requests? If so, I need you to understand something important. You cannot pour from an empty container indefinitely. Eventually, if this pattern continues, you may find yourself in your later years without adequate resources for your own care, and this outcome does not actually benefit your children either, because a parent without financial security often becomes, eventually, a financial dependent themselves. The fifth warning sign: gratitude has been replaced by expectation. This final warning sign is perhaps the most emotionally painful to recognize. In the early stages of financial helping, gratitude is usually genuine and clearly expressed. Over time, if the pattern continues without boundaries, gratitude often fades, replaced by a quiet, unspoken assumption that continued help is simply how things are. If you notice that your financial assistance is received with less appreciation than it once was, or if you notice frustration or irritation when you express any hesitation, this suggests that what began as a gift has slowly transformed into an expectation. Why we give even when we know we shouldn't. I think it is important, my friends, to talk honestly about why so many of us continue giving even after we recognize these warning signs. Understanding our own motivations is essential if we hope to change our patterns. For many of us, the fear underneath our giving is not really about our children's immediate need. It is about our own deep-seated fear of becoming a parent who does not help, a fear that refusing money somehow makes us unloving, uninvolved, or uncaring. This fear often traces back to our own upbringing, to messages we absorbed decades ago about what good parents do and do not do. For others, the motivation is guilt, sometimes guilt about mistakes made during our children's upbringing, mistakes we now feel we must compensate for through financial generosity in adulthood. I want to say to you gently but honestly, money cannot repair emotional wounds from childhood, no matter how much of it you offer. If guilt is driving your giving, I encourage you to consider addressing that guilt directly, through honest conversation or even professional support, rather than attempting to resolve it through your bank account. And for many of us, if I am honest, the motivation is simply fear of conflict. Saying no often triggers uncomfortable conversations, disappointment, sometimes even anger. It feels easier, in the moment, to simply give the money and avoid the conflict entirely. But my friends, avoiding short-term discomfort by giving in repeatedly often creates far greater long-term damage, both to your finances and, ironically, to the very relationship you were trying to protect by avoiding conflict in the first place. What healthy financial boundaries actually look like? I want to be very clear that I am not suggesting you should never help your adult children financially. There are times when temporary, thoughtful assistance is genuinely appropriate and loving. What I am suggesting is that this assistance should exist within clear boundaries, rather than flowing endlessly without limits or conditions. Here is what I now believe healthy financial boundaries look like, based on everything I have learned through my own difficult experience. First, any financial help should be the exception, not an ongoing pattern. If you find yourself providing regular, recurring assistance rather than occasional, specific help during genuine emergencies, this is worth reconsidering carefully. Second, before giving, ask yourself honestly whether this help is addressing a genuine, unavoidable crisis, or whether it is simply removing a natural consequence that might otherwise teach an important lesson about financial responsibility. Not every difficulty your child faces requires your intervention. Sometimes, struggle itself is the teacher your child actually needs. Third, consider being transparent about your own financial limits. I now tell my children directly what I can and cannot afford to give, rather than allowing them to assume my resources are unlimited. This transparency, uncomfortable as it initially felt, has actually improved our relationship, because it replaced vague assumptions with honest, clear understanding. Fourth, protect your own retirement and healthcare funds as non-negotiable. I now think of these funds the way I think of my own physical organs, essential, not available for lending, regardless of how urgent or emotional the request might be. This is not selfishness. This is responsible stewardship of the resources that will determine whether you can care for yourself in your final years without becoming a burden to anyone. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, separate your love from your giving. Your children need to understand, through your words and your actions, that your love for them does not depend on your financial generosity, and your generosity does not measure the depth of your love. This separation, once clearly established, removes an enormous amount of unspoken pressure from the relationship on both sides. The conversation I wish I had sooner. I want to share with you the conversation I eventually had with each of my children, because I believe it may help you have a similar conversation in your own family, ideally sooner than I did. I sat down with each of them individually, calmly, without anger, and I explained honestly where our finances actually stood. I explained that continuing to provide the level of support we had been providing would seriously jeopardize our ability to care for ourselves in our later years. I explained that this was not a punishment or a withdrawal of love, but simply an honest reckoning with reality that I should have addressed years earlier. I want to be completely honest with you about how this went. It was not entirely comfortable. There was some initial disappointment, even some pushback from one of my children in particular, who had come to rely heavily on our ongoing support. But over time, something important happened. Each of my children adjusted. They found ways to manage their finances that did not depend on our continued assistance. And perhaps most surprisingly to me, our relationships did not weaken because of this conversation. In some ways, they actually strengthened, because the relationship was finally built on something more solid than financial dependency. Addressing the fear of being seen as selfish, I know some of you listening today may worry that setting these boundaries will make you appear selfish, uncaring, or ungenerous in the eyes of your children or your community. I understand this fear deeply, because I carried it myself for many years. But I want you to consider something important. Protecting your own financial security in your later years is not selfishness. It is responsibility. A parent who exhausts their own resources helping their adult children, only to become financially dependent on those same children in their later years, has not actually avoided being a burden. They have simply delayed and often magnified that burden, while also depleting the very resources that could have provided genuine security and dignity in their final decades. True generosity, my friends, exists within sustainable limits. Generosity that depletes your own foundation is not sustainable generosity. It is simply borrowed time before a much larger crisis arrives, a crisis that often affects not just you, but your entire family, including the very children you were trying to help. What this boundary actually gave my family since establishing these boundaries, several years ago now, I want to share honestly what has changed in our family. My own retirement savings have stabilized and even grown again, giving me genuine peace about my own future security. My relationships with my children, rather than weakening as I initially feared, have actually deepened, because our conversations now center on genuine connection rather than financial need. More importantly, I have watched each of my children develop financial skills and confidence that I do not believe they would have developed had I continued providing unlimited support. My youngest, who once relied heavily on our help, now manages a household budget with a discipline and competence that genuinely impresses me. I believe, looking back, that my continued giving had actually been delaying this growth rather than supporting it. I want to be clear that this was not an easy transformation, and it did not happen without some difficult conversations and uncomfortable adjustments along the way. But I can tell you honestly, from the perspective of 72 years, that establishing these boundaries was one of the most important decisions I have made for both my own security and, ultimately, for the genuine well-being of my children. My final words to you, my dear friends, if you take only one thing from this warning today, let it be this: love and money are not the same currency, and confusing them serves no one well, not you, and not your children. You can love your children completely, fiercely, unconditionally, while still maintaining clear, healthy boundaries around your financial resources. Before you give money to your adult children again, I encourage you to pause and ask yourself honestly, is this addressing a genuine, temporary crisis, or is this simply continuing a pattern that may be quietly costing me my own future security? Is this help empowering my child toward greater independence, or is it gently preventing the growth that struggle itself often provides? And am I giving from a place of genuine choice, or am I giving from fear, guilt, or an inability to tolerate the discomfort of saying no? Your retirement, your healthcare, your later years of security and dignity, these matter. They matter not just for your own sake, but for your children's sake as well, because a parent who has protected their own foundation is a parent who never becomes an unexpected burden during years that should be filled with peace rather than financial crisis. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. I share this warning not to discourage generosity, but to encourage wisdom alongside it. If these words resonated with you, I hope you will take an honest look at your own patterns of giving, and I hope, whatever you decide, that you make that decision from a place of clarity and strength, rather than fear and guilt. This has been Life Mastery 60+. Until next time, protect your peace, protect your future, and remember that true love and healthy boundaries have always belonged together.